Sims raised his gaze to the Shepherd's Court complex in the Mayfair area before entering the grand, harmonious gate. The complex, built without regard for ostentation in the Shepherd Market area, conveyed a sense of prudence, high cost, and discretion. Inside the complex, Sims' footsteps muffled on the long, soft carpet. There was a velvety chair and a planter filled with flowering plants, in front of an elevator with stairs on one side. To the right of the lobby was a door marked library. Sims pushed the door open and found himself in a small room with a guest service desk, a small table behind it, a printer, and 2 chairs, one near the small table, the other, more luxurious, positioned at an angle by the window. The room was empty. Sims noticed a bell on the guest service desk made of mahogany, so he pressed it. When no one responded, he pressed it again. After a moment, a door in the opposite wall opened, revealing a sharply dressed man in a service uniform. His appearance suggested a foreign general or marshal, but his accent was that of a Londoner, specifically the unrefined London dialect. "Yes, sir? I'm looking for Mrs. Forden Claude's apartment. It's on the 3rd floor. Would you like me to call her before you go up?" "She's here, isn't she? I thought she was in the countryside." "She's been here since last Saturday." "And Mr. David Hunter?" "Mr. Hunter was here too. He hasn't traveled?" "No, sir. Was he here last night?" The marshal suddenly became aggressive. "Well, what are these questions? Do you want to know the history of everyone's life?" Sims silently produced his police badge and showed it to the man, who immediately relaxed and became more cooperative, saying, "I'm very sorry. How can I assist with your work?" "Now then, was Mr. Hunter here last night?" "Yes, sir, he was here, at least to my knowledge. That is, he didn't say he would be traveling." "Would you have known if he had traveled?" "In general, no, I wouldn't usually know. Residents typically inform us if they will be away from the complex, leaving specific instructions regarding messages or what they want us to say to callers." "Do phone calls go through this office?" "Most apartments have their own phone lines. However, a few residents prefer not to have a separate line, and in those cases, we use the internal phone to ask them to come down and answer their calls from the lobby phone." "But Mrs. Claude's apartment has its own line, correct?" "Yes, sir. So, according to your information, both were here last night?" "Yes. What about meals?" "There is a restaurant in the complex, but Mrs. Claude and Mr. Hunter seldom use it. They usually go out for dinner." "And breakfast?" "Breakfast is provided for the apartments." "I'd like to know if breakfast was served to them this morning." "I can find that out from the room service department." Sims nodded and said, "I'll go up now. Let me know when you have the information." "Certainly, sir." Sims entered the elevator and pressed the button for the 3rd floor. Each floor had only 2 apartments. Sims rang the bell for apartment number 4, and David Hunter opened the door. Not recognizing the commissioner, Hunter greeted him curtly. "Yes, what is it?" "Mr. Hunter?" "Yes. I'm Commissioner Sims. May I speak with you?" "Sorry, Commissioner. I thought you were a salesman. Please come in." He led Sims into a modern, beautifully furnished room where Rosalind Claude was lounging nearby. The window, and they turned when they entered. David Hunter introduced Commissioner Silas Rosalind and said, "Please, Commissioner, have a seat. Would you like something to drink?" "No, thank you, Mr. Hunter," Rosalind said. Rosalind had slightly bowed her head, and now she sat with her back to the window, her hands tightly clasped in her lap. David offered a cigarette and asked, "Do you smoke?" Sims took the cigarette, thanked him, then watched David as he fumbled in his pocket, pulled out the cigarette, furrowed his brow, looked around, and then took a match, struck it, and lit the commissioner's cigarette. He then lit his own cigarette and said calmly, "Well, what went wrong in Wormsley? Has it turned out that our cook is involved in the black market? She provides us with excellent food, and I always wondered if she was." The subject had an ominous story behind it. The commissioner replied, "It's a bit more serious than that. A man died at the Stag Hotel last night. Perhaps you read about it in the papers?" "About him?" David shook his head and said, "No, I didn't notice." "And what?" "Not only did he die, but he was murdered. His head was crushed." Rosalind gasped in surprise, trying to stifle her reaction, so Sims quickly added, Please, Commissioner, don't go into details. My sister is very delicate and can't handle such things. If she hears about blood, she might faint. The matter wasn't as gruesome as blood, but it was certainly a murder. David's eyebrows raised, and he said gently, "You're piquing my interest. Where do we stand in all this?" "We were hoping," said the commissioner, "that you might provide us with something about this man, Mr. Hunter. I went to see him last Saturday. His name was Enoch Arden, or so he registered himself at the hotel." "Oh yes, now I remember," David said calmly and unashamedly. "Well, Mr. Sins? I'm afraid I can't help you, Commissioner. I don't know anything about the man. Was his name really Enoch Arden?" "I doubt it very much." "And why did you go to see him?" "Just one of those usual unlucky stories. He mentioned certain places from the war and people. It was just an attempt to ask for money, I think, and the rest was more like false excuses." "Did you give him any money, Mr. Hunter?" David replied after a very brief pause, £5 only. It was true that he was involved in the war. "Did he mention any names that you know? Was one of those names Captain Robert Underhay?" David finally got the reaction he wanted. His posture stiffened, and Rosalind behind him gave a small gasp of fear. David finally asked, "What makes you think that, Commissioner?" His eyes were sharp and wary. The commissioner replied coldly, concealing his feelings. "Information we've received." David was watching the commissioner carefully as he continued. "Do you, Commissioner, have any idea who Robert Underhay might be?" "I'd like you to tell me." "Robert Underhay was my sister's first husband, and he died in Africa several years ago." Sins quickly asked, "Are you absolutely sure of that, Mr. Hunter?" "Absolutely sure," David confirmed. "That's what happened, isn't it, Rosalind?" She turned to him, saying quickly and with heavy breaths, "Yes, he died of fever, black water fever. It was very sad. Sometimes stories are not true, Mrs. Claude." She said nothing, looking at her brother, then added after a few moments, "Robert is dead." The commissioner said, "I understood from the information I have that this man, Enoch Arden, claimed to be a friend of the late Robert Underhay while at the same time told you, Mr. Hunter, that Robert Underhay was still alive." David shook his head and said, "That's nonsense, absolutely nonsense." "Are you specifically denying that Robert Underhay's name was mentioned?" David smiled charmingly and said, "Oh, it was mentioned. The poor man knew Underhay." "Was there a case of blackmail, Mr. Hunter?" "Blackmail? I don't understand you, Commissioner." "Doesn't anyone understand me, Mr. Hunter? By the way, just as a formality, where were you last night between 7 and 11? And you presume, as a formality, that I refuse to answer? Aren't you acting a bit childishly, Mr. Hunter?" "I don't think I've always hated being intimidated." The commissioner felt that this might be true. He had previously known witnesses like David Hunter, witnesses who obstructed investigations merely out of their love for creating obstacles, not because they were hiding certain facts. It seemed that merely asking them to explain their behavior and whereabouts was enough to stir their pride and obstinacy, focusing their attention on creating as many problems as they could in the course of justice. Although Commissioner Sins prided himself on his open-mindedness, he came to this assembly with a firm belief that David Hunter was the murderer. Now he felt for the first time that he wasn't sure of that, and the same childish doubts that characterized David's demeanor and challenge were aroused in him. Sins looked at Rosalind Claude, who immediately responded, saying to her brother David, "Why don't you tell him?" The commissioner added, "Yes, Mrs. Claude, you only need to clarify things." David, angry, said, "You must stop pressuring my sister. Do you hear? And what does it matter where I was, whether here or in Wormsley before, or at the far end of the earth?" Sins warned, "You will be summoned for court questioning, Mr. Hunter, and there you will have to answer the questions." "I'll await the questioning then. And now, Commissioner, will you please leave me alone?" The commissioner stood up calmly and said, "Very well, sir, but I have a question for Mrs. Claude before that. I don't want to disturb my sister." "Certainly, but I want her to take a look at the man and tell me if she recognizes him. I'm speaking here within my rights. This matter needs to be resolved sooner or later, so why not let her come with me now and settle it?" A witness said that Mr. Arden claimed to know Robert Underhay. so he might also know Mrs. Underhay, and perhaps Mrs. Underhay knows him. If his name isn't Enoch Arden, it would be useful to know what his real name is. Unexpectedly, Rosalind stood up and said, "I'll come, of course." Sins expected another wave of anger from David, but what surprised him was that David smiled and said, "That's good, Rosalind, and I must admit that you are personally curious about this matter. Perhaps, in the end, you can put a name to that man." Sins asked her, "Haven't you seen him at Wormsley Villa?" She shook her head and said, "Never, I've been here since last Saturday." "Mr. Arden arrived on Friday night?" Rosalind asked. "Do you want me to go now?" She asked her question with a somewhat childlike eagerness, which positively affected the commissioner despite himself. She had a willingness and readiness that he didn't expect. He said to her, "That would be a great kindness, Mrs. Claude. The sooner we resolve the facts, the better, but I don't have a police car." David crossed the room toward the phone, saying, "I'll call the car rental office. It may be outside your legal authority to rent a car, but I think you can arrange that, Commissioner." "I think that's possible, Mr. Hunter," replied Sins. Then he stood up and said, "I'll be waiting for you both downstairs." He took the elevator down and opened the office door again. The marshal was waiting for him and asked, "Well, what did you find?" "Both beds were used last night, sir, as well as the bathrooms and towels. They had breakfast in the apartment at 9:30 this morning." "Do you know at what time Mr. Hunter returned last night?" "I fear that I have no additional information, sir." It seems that Ray Sins felt his mission with the marshal was over. Although David Hunter's speech may suggest otherwise, the Chinese challenge must be addressed. He should understand that the accusation of murder is looming over him, and he certainly needs to realize that his prompt testimony is in his best interest. It is unwise to antagonize the police, though David Hunter finds great pleasure in precisely that. The three spoke little during the drive, and when they arrived at the morgue, Roseanne Claude was completely pale and trembling. David was worried about her and spoke to her as if she were a young child, saying, "It will only take a minute or two, dear, nothing unpleasant, so don't worry. The inspector will be with you shortly, and I will wait for you. There is no need for a long wait. You'll find him calm, almost like a sleeping person." She nodded and extended her hand, which he squeezed encouragingly, saying, "Be a brave girl, dear." As she followed the inspector, she said in her gentle voice, "Please don't think me too sentimental, Inspector, but when everyone in the house dies, except for me, that night in London was really something?" He replied kindly, "I understand, Mrs. Claude. I know you went through a traumatic experience during the German raids when your husband was killed, but it really only takes a few moments." With a signal from Sins, the cover was lifted from the body, and Roseanne Claude stood looking at the man who identified himself as Enoch Arden, while Sins stood by, observing her attentively without intervening. She looked at the deceased with curiosity bordering on confusion. There was no surprise or emotional reaction as she continued to look at him for a long time with amazement. Then she said calmly and realistically, "May God have mercy on him. I have never seen this man in my life. I don't know who he is." Sins thought to himself, "Either you are one of the best actresses I've ever known, or you're telling the truth." Later, Sins told Rowley, "I took the widow to the morgue, and she insists that it is not Robert Derry, and that she has never seen him before. That should conclude the case." Rowley paused for a moment and then said slowly, "Does it really conclude it? I would think any jury would believe her, in the absence of any contradictory evidence, of course." Rowley said, "Yes," and then hung up the phone. Afterward, Rowley frowned as he flipped through the London phone directory, not the local directory, and quickly found what he was looking for.